He didn't speak when he entered the room. He didn't need to. The way he closed the door, slow, deliberate, said enough. I was already sitting on the edge of the bed, hands clenched in the folds of my nightgown, waiting, knowing. He moved, like someone used to being obeyed, not loved. His fingertips brushed my collarbone, then tightened gently, not to hurt, but to remind me I belonged to him now. And that night, when he laid claim to me, he never asked. Because he didn't believe. I had the right to say no. If that first moment caught your breath, leave a like. It tells us you're still listening. And if stories that begin in silence but end in something deeper speak to you, subscribe. There's more waiting. They say every girl dreams of her wedding day. I used to too. Not in glitter and lace, but in the way my mother once hummed softly, while mending a white curtain by the window. Her fingers thin, trembling slightly, threading the needle in one graceful motion. She'd say, "It's not the dress that matters, Evelyn. It's the promise you make in it." That curtain hung in our kitchen for 16 years. It was the closest thing I had to a veil. I still remember the warmth of her hands the last morning, at home. She cupped my cheeks gently, even though her skin was cold from the medicine. Her eyes, dulled from the illness, searched mine like she was looking for the girl I used to be before everything fractured. She didn't say, "Don't go." That wasn't her way. She just tucked a silver ring into my palm and whispered, "Do what you must, but don't forget who you are." I haven't taken that ring off since. The marriage wasn't arranged out of love. It was arranged out of mercy. His or mine, I still don't know. Christopher Alden's name came with power and precision, like a signature carved into steel. When he walked into our lives, it was under the guise of saving our home from foreclosure. My mother's illness had consumed more than her memory. It had devoured our savings, too. Christopher, ever practical, offered terms. Clear, cold, calculated, a private wedding, a 1-year arrangement, no expectations beyond what was stated in the contract. And me? I signed because it was the only way to keep my family from slipping into homelessness. Because I had a little brother who still believed I could fix things. Because sometimes honor isn't loud. It's silent, heavy, and made of sacrifice. I arrived at the estate the night before the ceremony. It was larger than I imagined. Not opulent in the vulgar sense, but intimidating. The kind of place where silence has shape, and every room remembers things you weren't part of. Marble floors, high ceilings, paintings that watched. A chandelier hung in the grand hall, like 1,000 frozen teardrops. The guest room they gave me smelled faintly of cedarwood and lemon oil. Everything was spotless, empty, like no one had ever cried here. I sat on the edge of the bed that night in my mother's old nightgown, tracing the stitching she'd once sewn into the hem, EH, her initials, not mine. She had always said, "Every woman gives a little of herself away when she loves someone. Just don't forget to keep a peace." I clutched that peace like it might keep me breathing. The wedding wasn't at a church, nor in a garden blooming with roses. It was in a library. Yes, a library. Surrounded by shelves of old books and dust-scented stillness, with a justice of the peace who looked more bored than blessed. Christopher wore a suit, as if it were armor. I wore a dress my mother once altered from an old gown left in a neighbor's attic. It was ivory, not white, and it didn't fit quite right. We didn't exchange vows. We didn't even look at each other. I said, "I do," like it meant nothing, when it actually meant everything. He said nothing at all. That night, I expected him to come to me, not because I wanted it, not because I was ready, but because that's what stories like this were supposed to become. Quiet, legal submission. I'd read enough of them in dog-eared novels stacked on our shelves back home. Brides bought and silenced by duty, bedrooms turned into battlegrounds of power. I sat in the middle of the bed, knees drawn to my chest, waiting. My palms were slick. My breath shallow. The silence grew so loud I heard my own heartbeat. Then I heard the door open. Christopher didn't look angry or eager. He simply walked in, as if checking an appointment off a list. His eyes swept the room, not me. They were gray, not like the ocean or storm clouds, but like stone. Unreadable, unmoving. He stopped near the armchair across the room and spoke only once. "You'll sleep here tonight. I'll stay in the West Wing. This marriage is what it needs to be, not more. You don't owe me anything." Then he turned and left. The door clicked shut like a seal on silence. I didn't cry. Not that night. Not even when the full weight of what I'd done pressed down on my chest like a stone slab. I lay back against the pillows, too soft, too foreign, and stared at the ceiling, where a single light flickered faintly, casting shadows that stretched across the crown molding like reaching fingers. I held the silver ring against my chest, pressing it into the skin just above my heart. I remembered the way my mother had looked at me that morning, loving, worried, proud. And I whispered into the dark, "If this is honor, why does it ache so much? They say every girl dreams of her wedding day. Mine wasn't a dream. It was a beginning carved out of necessity, dressed in silence. But even beginnings like this can change. Even stone can warm under the right hands, and maybe, just maybe, so could he." The morning after the wedding, I awoke before the sun. Old habits, I suppose. When you've spent most of your life rising early to prepare breakfast for a mother too, tired to stand, the body forgets how to rest, even when the world expects it to. The guest room was still and hushed, bathed in a silver hush from the window. Outside, mist clung to the trees like secrets. The sheets smelled of starch and lavender, but the air in the room tasted faintly of absence, like it hadn't truly belonged to anyone in years. I pulled a cardigan over my nightgown and stepped barefoot into the hallway. The estate was quiet, eerily so. Every creak of the wooden floor echoed like a thought spoken aloud. The walls were adorned with oil paintings in gold frames. Women in silk dresses, men with steel gazes. I wondered if they were Christopher's ancestors. They looked as if they didn't take kindly to strangers, and I felt like one. I wandered toward the kitchen, more out of instinct than intention. The scent of brewed coffee lingered faintly in the air, fresh but fading. Someone had been up before me. I expected to find a staff member, a maid, a butler perhaps, but there was no one. The kitchen was spacious and modern, yet somehow lacked warmth. Chrome fixtures, marble countertops, the kind of curated elegance that looks like it belongs in a magazine more than in a family. Still, I found comfort in the smallest things, the ticking of the wall clock, the way light poured across the floor in slow, golden stripes. On a narrow shelf above the sink sat a small ceramic jar, hand-painted, chipped along the rim. It reminded me of the one we'd had in our old house, where Mama kept lavender and loose sugar cubes. I reached up and gently lifted it, turning it in my hands. Underneath it, I found a small folded cloth napkin. Embroidered initials, E.H., faded but familiar. My heart stumbled. This wasn't mine. This was my grandmother's. I returned to the hallway, drawn now by something deeper than curiosity. I followed the corridor to a quiet corner, where a tall, wooden cabinet stood. Inside, behind the glass, were more keepsakes. China sets, photo frames, old books. One spine caught my eye. Whispers in the Orchard by Lenora Banks. I froze. My grandmother had owned that same book. It had her notes in the margins, in tiny blue cursive. I pulled it gently from the shelf and flipped it open. There they were. Her words. This was her house. I remembered now. I was 6, maybe 7. The last time we'd visited my grandparents here before they sold the estate and moved south. Mama said the family had fallen on hard times after my grandfather's business failed, and they'd had to give the house up. I hadn't recognized it until now. It had changed, been remodeled, modernized, stripped of its soul, and repainted with quiet money. But beneath the upgrades, the bones were the same. The shape of the windows, the way the staircase curved like a ribbon. Even the creak in the third floorboard from the kitchen still whispered my name. I was standing in the house that used to be ours. I confronted Christopher that evening. He was in his office, behind a desk that looked more like a monument than furniture. Sleek, dark, cold. He was reading something on a tablet, his jaw set in that way it always was, like he was preparing for a war no one else saw coming. Why didn't you tell me this house belonged to my family? He looked up slowly, calmly, as if I had asked him about the weather. I didn't think it mattered. It matters to me, I said, my voice low, steady. This was my grandmother's. My mother grew up here. I played on these floors when I was a child, and now I'm here again, like some tenant in my own story. He set the tablet down. Bought this property 10 years ago. It was listed through an auction. No name was attached. I didn't know the connection until I saw your eyes in the hallway the first day you arrived. They look like hers. I stared at him, unsure if it was a compliment, an accusation, or simply fact. He stood and moved to the window, hands in his pockets. I didn't bring you here to hurt you, Evelyn. If I could have done this differently, maybe I would have. But the truth is, I needed someone who wouldn't flinch at silence. This house, it's beautiful, but it hasn't been alive in years. Then why keep it? I asked. Because some debts, he said, turning to face me, can't be paid with money. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed again. But it felt different now. I wasn't in a stranger's house anymore. I was in a memory, a shadow, a place that had once held my laughter, and now held my secrets. And for the first time, I wondered, had Christopher brought me here to fulfill a contract? Or to give something back he thought he'd taken? The difference was subtle, but it might be the thread everything would unravel from. The thing about silence is that it doesn't stay still. It moves with you, follows you from room to room like a draft through an old house. I used to think silence was something you escaped, but living with Christopher taught me otherwise. Silence here was a language, and he spoke it fluently. 3 weeks into the marriage, I still hadn't shared a real meal with him. Not once. He'd leave the house early, return late, always in a suit with the collar still perfectly stiff, as if emotion had no place in his day. His office door stayed closed. His phone never rang. He was present, technically, but he never really arrived. And still, I found myself drawn to him. Not in the romantic way women are drawn to a man's broad shoulders or sharp jawline. I was drawn like a moth to a room with one warm lamp, flickering, behind frosted glass, not quite light, not quite dark, just waiting. It was the drawer that changed everything. I didn't mean to open it. Honestly, I didn't. I was dusting. That was all. The housekeeper, Greta, had taken a few days off to visit her son in Ohio, and in a strange twist of domestic instinct, I found myself reaching for the duster like my mother once did, as if wiping down picture frames would help me feel less like a visitor in my own life. Christopher's study was austere. Wood, leather, sharp lines. The fireplace hadn't been lit in what looked like years. On his desk sat 3 pens arranged with surgical precision, a single notebook with no visible creases, and a framed photograph turned face down. The drawer, second from the left, was locked. Just that one. A small thing, I know. But when everything else in his world was so open, so visible, the lock sang louder than any open door, and so I asked. I was cleaning, I said over dinner that night. Our first meal eaten in the same room, though not side by side. He was seated across the long dining table, a flickering candle between us making his expression unreadable. I noticed one of the drawers in your office was locked. He paused mid-cut of his steak. Looked up. And? I forced a small smile. Curiosity isn't a sin, is it? In this house, he said evenly. It depends what you do with it. There was no anger in his voice, but the air around us thinned just enough to notice. I didn't touch it, I said, quietly now. I just wondered. He didn't respond, but he set his fork down gently. Then he said, That drawer holds the only thing in this house I've never tried to forget, and that was the end of dinner. Later that night, I passed his office. The door was ajar. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Christopher was seated behind the desk, the locked drawer now open. Inside, I glimpsed a photograph, worn at the corners, edges curling like paper left out in the rain. His hand hovered over it, fingers trembling slightly before curling into a fist. He didn't notice me. I walked away before he could, and for the first time, I wondered if the man I married wasn't hiding power, but pain. The next morning, he left early again, and I went into the office. The drawer was closed, still locked. But the photo, it was gone from the desk. In its place sat something else, a small card, folded once, with my name written in ink. The same shade as the sky before a storm. Evelyn. I hesitated. Opened it. Inside, 2 sentences. Nothing more. Her name was Elise. We were engaged once. I don't speak of her because I don't know how to grieve something I chose to walk away from. I sat back in the chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. He had once loved someone and lost her. Not to death, but to choice. And now he was living with that choice every day, behind locked drawers, closed doors, and dinner tables set for silence. I wanted to hate him less. That was the strangest part. I'd expected a cruel man, a cold man, the kind who used a woman's name as currency, her body as payment for kindness never promised. But this man had learned to live with the cost of his own walls. That night, I brewed tea the way my mother used to. 2 bags steeped long, a touch of honey. I knocked on the office door. No answer, so I left the mug outside. When I returned the next morning, the mug was gone, and in its place, a single white gardenia had been laid on the hall table. The drawer was still locked, but something inside us both had opened, even if only a sliver. When I was a child, my mother taught me how to prune a rosebush, not with gloves but with patience. You have to know what to cut, she'd say, her hands weathered and bare, moving with surprising tenderness through the thorns. Some things look like they're alive, but they're only holding the rest back. I remembered that lesson. The morning I found him in the garden. It wasn't a garden in the usual sense, not a place of fresh bloom or bright joy. It sat in the farthest corner of the estate, tucked behind the west wing where the trees grew taller, older, and heavier with time. No one ever mentioned it. I found it by accident, chasing the distant sound of a spade against soil. When I stepped past the hedgerow, the world changed. The estate's manicured perfection gave way to a raw, forgotten silence. And in the middle of it, kneeling among thorns and roots, was Christopher. No suit, no steel mask. Just a man in rolled-up sleeves, dirt on his palms, sweat at his brow, tending to what looked like a patch of stubborn, undergrown roses. He didn't see me at first. He was humming. Low, quiet, nearly imperceptible. It wasn't a song I recognized, but it stopped me cold. Because never once in 3 weeks had I seen him smile. And now, with soil under his nails and sunlight catching the edge of his cheek, he looked almost gentle. He caught sight of me, eventually, straightened slowly. His voice was rough with surprise. "You're up early." I crossed my arms. "You're gardening." A shrug. "It's less complicated than people." "That's not what most people say." "Then most people have never met enough people." His smile was dry but real. I stepped closer, eyes skimming the bare stalks. "These look dead." "They're not," he replied, reaching for a small sprout with new buds. "They're stubborn and tired, but they remember how to bloom." That afternoon, I returned alone. The garden had once been beautiful. I could tell by the way the stones were laid like a path through memory. I sat on the edge of the old bench, worn and softened by weather. There was a plaque nailed to the wood. I leaned down to read it. In honor of Ellie Hart, for the garden she dreamed of, and the heart she gave to it. My breath caught. Ellie Hart. My mother. I didn't cry. Not then. I stood slowly, scanning the space around me with new eyes. The shape of the plot. The curve of the bench. The white trellis arch that now stood chipped and overgrown. I remembered this place. It had been hers, a gift from my father when they first married. She'd planted every corner with dreams. Roses, daisies, peonies. The earth had once answered her. And now it sat quiet and brittle. Christopher hadn't bought this house as a stranger. He had kept it for her. That evening, I waited until the hallway was still before knocking on his door. He opened it without surprise, as though he knew I'd come. "Why didn't you tell me the garden was hers?" He leaned against the frame, silent for a moment. "I didn't think you'd want the memory brought back." "I already carry the memory," I said, "but I didn't know someone else was carrying it too." He looked down. "She helped me, once, a long time ago, when I was younger, before I had anything worth offering." He gestured toward the darkened sitting room behind him. "She told me not everything broken stays broken, that people, like gardens, need time and light and someone willing to get their hands dirty." A pause. Then, I didn't believe her. Then, I do now. He stepped aside, letting me in. The room was warm, dimly lit. A fire crackled low in the hearth. I noticed the way his shoulders lowered, just slightly as I sat. He poured tea, 2 cups, one handed to me without flourish, just familiarity. We didn't speak for a while. And then, he said it, quietly, like an old truth finally given breath. "I bought this house after your family lost it. I didn't know who it belonged to until your name came across my desk years later. Evelyn Hart. You kept it for her." He shook his head. "I kept it because she believed in things I didn't. Because she once looked at me, just a broken man with a ruined name, and said I was worth more than I believed. I bought this house hoping to feel that again. But I never expected you to walk through the door." That night, I stood at my bedroom window, watching the wind move through the trees beyond the garden. He hadn't planted flowers to impress me. He hadn't bought this place as a trophy. He'd preserved it. For her. For what she gave him. And perhaps now, for what I might give myself permission to feel. I still didn't know if I could love him, but I no longer believed he was incapable of love. Sometimes. The most beautiful gardens are the ones no one sees bloom, because they're growing back after being cut too far. Maybe in time so could we. My mother forgot who I was the week before Christmas. She looked at me from her bed, eyes open, clear, and smiled like I was someone else entirely. "Clara?" she whispered, her voice rasping through the oxygen mask. I didn't correct her. I just smiled and nodded, because sometimes love isn't about telling the truth. It's about making someone feel safe inside their fading mind. Clara was her sister, long gone, long buried. But in that moment, my mother wasn't afraid, and neither was I. The call came one afternoon, while I was sorting linens in the hallway closet. The nurse's voice was soft, practiced. "She's been asking for you." I took the next train home. The town looked smaller than I remembered. Winter dulled the houses to the color of old paper, and the trees looked like skeletons frozen in prayer. When I stepped off the platform, the wind sliced through my coat like it had something to prove. Christopher offered to drive me. I hadn't asked. I found him by the kitchen window the night before, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee, staring out into the garden like it could speak. I said I needed to go. He nodded once, and the next morning he was waiting with the car warmed, gloves already on the seat beside him. We didn't talk much during the drive. But at one point, he reached over and turned the heat toward my side without saying a word. That was enough. She was smaller than I remembered. My mother's face had shrunk into itself, her cheekbones more pronounced, her hands paper-thin. But her eyes, when they met mine, still carried the soft defiance that raised me. "You look tired," she said. "You look beautiful," I answered. She smiled. Liar. And for a second, I almost forgot she was dying. Christopher stayed at the house. Not in the spare room, but in the living room, on the old couch that still dipped in the center from years of use. He made tea every morning, folded the laundry, shoveled the walkway when it snowed. He didn't ask what he could do. He just did things. One morning, I found him at the dining table with my mother, reading aloud from a book she could no longer hold. His voice was low, even. She was smiling. Later that day, she told me, "That man loves you, you know." I shook my head, laughing softly. "No, he doesn't. He's just kind." "Don't be foolish," she said, eyes sharper than I'd seen in weeks. "A man who makes tea, reads poetry, and doesn't run when things get ugly. He may not know it yet, but he's halfway in." On the third night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the back porch wrapped in my father's old coat, staring into the trees where the moonlight made ghosts of the branches. The cold bit at my knuckles, but I didn't care. I felt hollow, worn, like I'd been poured out slowly over the past year. Christopher came out a few minutes later. He handed me a mug of tea, steeped just right, honey not sugar, and sat beside me without a word. "I don't know how to do this," I said after a long pause. "Let her go. Watch her leave piece by piece." "You don't," he said quietly. "You just stay." I looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't look composed or distant. He looked tired, like he'd lived this kind of sorrow before. "Who did you lose?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then finally, "My mother. Years ago. Not like this. But it was slow. Not in the body, but in the way she looked at me. Like I wasn't her son anymore. Like I'd become someone else she couldn't recognize." Took a long breath. I didn't stay. I left when it got hard. I told myself business needed me. But truth is, I was afraid. And now, I stay. The next morning, she called me by my name. Just once. Evelyn, she whispered as I adjusted her blanket. I'm glad you married him. I looked down, surprised. Why? She smiled weakly. Because he doesn't speak like someone who owns you. He moves like someone afraid to lose you. Her hand brushed mine, cold but firm. You belong to yourself, sweetheart. But if you ever decide to belong to someone else, make sure they know the difference. She passed quietly 2 nights later. No drama, no gasping. Just one long breath that never circled back. I was holding her hand. Christopher was in the hallway, giving space without being far. The nurse asked if I wanted time alone. I said no. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, head on her chest, letting the silence settle into my bones. I didn't cry. Not then. Grief, for me, always came like rain that waited until after the storm. We buried her 2 days before Christmas. The funeral was small, just close friends, some neighbors. The church bells rang hollow, like a memory that no longer fits inside your chest. Christopher stood in the back, dark coat, gloved hands folded. He didn't speak during the service, didn't approach me until after the others had left. Then, he handed me something, a folded cloth napkin, faded, old. It was my grandmother's. I found it in a box in the estate, he said softly. Thought you'd want to keep it. I nodded, unable to speak. As I turned to walk away, he touched my shoulder. Not hard, just enough for me to stop. You don't owe me anything, he said. I know. But I'd like to earn whatever comes next, if you'll let me. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, wrapped in a quilt my mother had sewn from old dresses and curtains, and finally let the tears come. Not just for the woman I'd lost, but for the strange, quiet man who had shown me that sometimes staying is the bravest thing a person can do. Grief is a strange kind of silence. It doesn't come all at once, like thunder. It arrives in pieces, between cups of tea gone cold, the closing of a door that used to creak, the quiet of a house that still smells like someone who no longer breathes inside it. After the funeral, I stayed behind for a few more days. Christopher didn't press. He simply offered to wait, then waited without asking for updates. He cleared the snow from the front steps each morning, restocked the firewood pile, and made sure my little brother's coat still fit. He did it without expecting a thank you. And that was what undid me. It snowed the morning I came back to the estate. Not a blizzard, just a gentle dusting, the kind that mutes the world and makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. I stood at the threshold of the grand foyer, suitcase still in hand, unsure if I was arriving home, or simply returning to a contract. Christopher was waiting near the staircase. He didn't say welcome back. He didn't smile. But he took the suitcase from my hand and carried it upstairs like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes, love doesn't look like affection. It looks like effort you didn't have to ask for. My room was just as I left it, unchanged, unbothered, except for one detail, the small photo frame on the nightstand. It held a picture I'd never seen. My mother in the estate's old garden, hair pinned up, sun in her eyes, laughing at something behind the camera. I turned it over. A note was taped to the back. Found. This in a box in the attic. She should always be in the room. No signature. I didn't need one. I found him in the study that evening, standing by the fireplace with a book in hand but unread. His expression was somewhere between thought and fatigue. I hesitated at the doorway. I wasn't sure if I should come down, I said softly. He turned. You live here. Do I? He looked at me for a long moment, then, almost too quietly, Yes. You do. I crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite his. My hands curled around the edges of the fabric like I needed to hold on to something. He didn't speak, and neither did I. But the quiet between us had changed. It didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like space. Room for something else to grow. "I'm not who I was before she died," I said after a while. "I don't know if I'm anything yet." He set the book down. "Grief reshapes people. It doesn't ask permission. I don't want to forget her. You won't." "How do you know?" "Because I still remember mine." There was no tremble in his voice, no self-pity, just truth, laid bare like winter branches against sky. He rose then, walked toward me slowly, stopping just short of arm's reach. "I don't want to overstep," he said. "But if you need—" His voice faltered just a little. "Someone who's not afraid to stay in the dark with you." I stood, not because I had the words, but because I didn't. I crossed the space between us and laid my head gently against his chest. His arms moved around me, tentative at first, like he was remembering how to hold someone. Then firmer, warmer, like he didn't know he needed it too. We stayed like that for a long time. No movement. No conversation. Just the steady thrum of his heart against my cheek, and the way our breathing slowly aligned. Later, when I pulled away, I looked up at him. His eyes weren't unreadable anymore. They were tired and open. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. He brushed a strand of hair from my face. His fingers lingered near my temple, a touch so soft it made me ache. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'd like to find out, slowly, if you'll let me." I nodded. And for the first time, the air between us felt like spring, not because everything had changed, but because something had finally begun. That night, I didn't return to my own room. I didn't follow him upstairs either. I simply fell, asleep in the armchair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket he'd placed over me when I wasn't looking. When I woke at dawn, he was sitting nearby, reading, one hand resting gently on the arm of my chair, as if making sure I didn't drift too. He looked up, met my eyes, said nothing. He didn't have to. Love hadn't arrived in a grand gesture. It hadn't broken the silence with a kiss under rain, or a speech at the edge of despair. It had come in the shape of a garden that once belonged to my mother. A cup of tea left outside a locked door. A photograph returned without fanfare. And now, in a touch that was neither possessive nor passing. It was just a man's hand resting on mine, and a woman learning, at last, that being held doesn't mean being owned. I packed in the early morning, not because I wanted to leave, but because I didn't know what else to do with the ache building in my chest. The house was still asleep. Snow still clung to the window panes. Even the garden outside seemed to hold its breath. I folded my sweaters in silence, not trusting my thoughts to be kind enough to speak aloud. There was no fight, no cruel word. No moment I could point to and say, "This is where it broke," only a slow unraveling. Something in me had begun to shift after the funeral. Grief has a strange way of hollowing you out, and sometimes you mistake the space it leaves behind for freedom. What I felt with Christopher had become real. Too real. And real meant risk. I zipped the suitcase halfway, then stopped. Downstairs, the hall was still dim with pre-dawn light. I passed the study, where the fireplace still held the embers of last night's warmth. A cup of tea sat untouched. On the side table, mine, I realized, the one I'd forgotten while reading. I glanced at the photo on the mantel. My mother's eyes met mine, mid-laughter, frozen in that garden years ago, and something in me cracked. I set the suitcase down by the door and walked outside. The air was sharp. Winter clung to every corner of the garden like it didn't know. how to leave. The bench still bore a thin layer of frost, and the roses, stubborn and brown, stood like soldiers waiting for a spring they weren't sure would come. I sat down anyway, wrapped my coat tighter, closed my eyes, and breathed. We're going to leave, a voice said behind me. I turned. Christopher stood near the archway, one hand still gloved, the other bare. His hair was tousled, as if he'd risen quickly. His eyes, though calm, held something raw. I wasn't sure, I admitted. That's not no. I looked back at the bench. It felt easier. Before I knew how much this place mattered. Before I knew you cared. I didn't ask you to care back. No, I said. You didn't. That's what makes it harder. He stepped forward. You're afraid. I laughed, soft, bitter. Of course I am. Afraid to belong to something again, to someone. What if I give you everything I have left and lose it too? Christopher didn't speak right away. Then, slowly, he took off the other glove, held it in his hand. When I was 28, he began, I built a company from the ground up. I was praised for not being afraid of risk. People said I was bold, brave, but I never risked anything that mattered. Not until Elise. He didn't look at me. His voice stayed even, but quiet. She wanted a life I couldn't give. I was too proud to change, so she left. And I told myself I didn't need her. That I was better alone. I wore that lie like armor for years. He turned then, eyes steady on mine. I'm not wearing it now. I stood, not to walk away, but to look him in the eye, without fear, without softness. If I stay, I said, it's not because of a contract, or debt, or pity. I know. If I stay, I need to know this isn't charity, that you're not holding on to a memory of my mother or your past. I'm not, he said simply. I'm holding on to you. Because for the first time in my life, I want something that wasn't built, bought, or won. He stepped closer. You didn't ask for this marriage, but you've made this house a home again. You brought life back into the garden. You reminded me how to care without needing control. A pause. If you need to leave to know it's real, I won't stop you. My heart hammered. I don't want to leave. He looked down, visibly exhaling for the first time. Then stay. I walked back into the house that morning with no suitcase in hand. Just a letter. It was tucked inside the old sewing box my mother had kept. One I hadn't touched in months. I found it by chance. Or perhaps because something in me needed it. Now. The envelope was yellowed, worn at the edges. Addressed to me. My Evelyn. If you're reading this, I've gone where mothers always do when they've said enough. I know how scared you are. Of becoming someone's wife. Of being alone. Of repeating my mistakes. Or worse, my silence. But here's what I want you to know. Home is not a place. It's the hand that reaches for yours in the dark and doesn't let go. And love is choosing to stay when leaving would hurt less. I believe in you. Mama. Christopher found me in the sunroom, letter in hand, tears trailing silently down my cheek. He didn't ask what it said. He just sat beside me, laid his hand gently over mine, and for the first time I leaned into him, because I wanted to, not because I was afraid. This wasn't surrender, it was choice. And in choosing to stay, I realized something else. I hadn't been running from him. I'd been running from the girl I used to be, the one who thought she had to carry everything alone. That girl was gone now. In her place stood a woman ready to belong. A year passed. Not all at once, but in small, almost imperceptible pieces, like petals, falling like a fire burning down to steady embers. And somewhere between winter's end and the early blush of spring, our story became something we no longer needed to explain. We simply lived it. I kept the garden. Not because I thought I could do it better than my mother, no one ever could, but because it deserved to be touched again, cared for, spoken to. Plants, like people, respond to gentleness. They bloom under kindness. Christopher joined me most mornings. At first, only to watch, then to help. His hands, once used to ledgers and signatures, learned the rhythm of soil and shears. He rarely spoke while we worked. He didn't need to. The silences between us had changed. They were full now, not empty. I often caught him looking at me, not in the way he used to, calculating and unreadable, but as if he was memorizing peace, like he was finally home. The contract between us expired in June. There was no mention of it, no dramatic pause, no drawn-out question of what now. We'd burned the paper in the fireplace the night before. His idea. "This marriage doesn't need a signature anymore," he said, placing the folded pages in my palm. "It needs a choice." We watched the flames together. I leaned into his, sighed. He kissed the top of my head. We never once used the word forever, but in that moment, I believed it. By fall, I'd opened the tea shop my mother once dreamed of, Evelyn's Garden, tucked in the corner of Maple and 2nd, where the light poured through the windows just right, and the scent of lemon verbena greeted each customer like an old friend. Christopher helped renovate the space, though he insisted he had no eye for decor. He preferred to stand back and watch me paint, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled, smiling like someone who couldn't believe this version of life belonged to him now. Sometimes, he'd show up just before closing, a novel in hand, reading quietly at the back table while I wiped down the counters. I'd bring him tea, milk, no sugar, and he'd look up, eyes warm. "Marry me again," he once said. I blinked. "What?" But this time he smiled. "Make it yours." I didn't say yes. I just kissed him. The day we returned to the estate to pack up his office, I found something in the bottom drawer. A letter, unmarked, unfolded. It was addressed to "The woman I hope will stay." I sat on the arm of the leather chair while he leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes soft. I used to think honor was about keeping your word, even when it hurts. But it's not. Honor is showing up every day, even when no one applauds you, even when it's hard, even when it means changing what you believed about yourself. You didn't save me, Evelyn. You reminded me that I could be worth saving. I'm not a man of poetry, but if I have one vow left in me, it's this. I will love you with quiet hands and steady breath. I will choose you on ordinary mornings, on hard nights, and on every day we are given, not because I must, because I can. See, I looked up. He wasn't watching me read. He was watching the window. The garden was just beginning to turn gold. Later, that evening, we sat outside on the bench my mother once chose. He held my hand loosely, thumb tracing the lines of my palm. I wore her ring now, not because I needed a symbol, but because it reminded me that women before me had endured and loved, and found ways to do both with grace. I used to think happiness would feel like thunder, I said. And now I think it feels like this. He squeezed my hand gently. Quiet? No, I said, leaning into his shoulder. Certain. A breeze passed through the trees. The last of summer's green began to give way, surrendering to autumn's gold. The roses behind us rustled, not in protest, but in peace. And in that soft, sacred hush, I heard it. Not the wind, not the leaves, but the whisper of something that had been with us all along. Honor. Not the heavy kind that breaks people with expectation. but the kind that heals, that stays, that holds you on a cold night with no need for words, that writes a letter and never expects it to be read, that chooses you, quietly and without fanfare, every ordinary day. They say not all love stories begin with love. Some begin with duty, with silence, with the ache of grief and the weight of promises made to the dying. But the best ones, the ones that last, they begin again and again, in gardens, in teacups, in the quiet touch of a hand that once didn't know how to hold. I once married a man without vows. Now every morning he makes me tea. And that, I've learned, is vow enough. If this story spoke to your heart, take a moment to give it a like. It lets us know these quiet moments matter to you. And if you'd like to hear more stories of love, legacy, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe. There's always another chapter waiting.